Africa may be forfeiting as much as 4.2 billion US dollars each year in interest payments on its loans, largely as a result of prevailing stereotypical narratives that pervade global media representations of the continent. The manner in which the media depicts Africa significantly influences investment decisions and over time affects the continent's overall financial stability. A panel of media specialists convened to examine the financial repercussions of media stereotypes on Africa's capacity to draw investment and foster economic development.
Hi, my name is Yinka Adigoke. I am the editor of Semaphore Africa, part of Semaphore. Semaphore was launched 2.5 years ago. It is a publication which covers the global economy, global geopolitics, and I specifically cover Africa with a network of journalists across the continent. Our focus is really about telling what I like to frame as a more complete story of Africa, and which goes from everything from business and technology to trade to also to culture and just the way the continent is evolving. Thank you.
I'm Wendy Tlo, and I'm the Chief Communication and Reputation Officer at Old Mutual. Mine is really to make sure that we tell a true and authentic story about Old Mutual to the world. I think also to make sure that we maintain our relationships with our stakeholders and do that in a way that is responsible, that is ethical, but that also assists to heighten and elevate who we are and what we stand for. But I think importantly, as an organization that is keenly interested and becoming an integrated financial services organization, my key role is about telling that story to South Africa and to the African continent and get as many people to experience what it is that we have on offer as an integrated financial services organization. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Moki Makura. It's very odd holding a mic and it's not actually projecting. Yeah, so my name is Moki Makura and I run an organization called Africa No Filter, which is a narrative change organization that is trying to change the narrative about Africa. We essentially do a couple of things. One is that we're trying to build a community of creatives, storytellers, media who care about how the world sees Africa and how Africa sees itself. But we're also an advocacy organization. That's where our research arm comes in. But one thing I do want to say is that we're a grant maker. We give out grants to storytellers. We fund the media. We support anybody who wants to show a different side to the continent. So that's what we do.
Thank you, Moki. And I am Toko Modise, and I am the head of communications at Brand South Africa. Our job is basically to profile South Africa and position South Africa. As a reputation management agency, our job is to put South Africa on the map and get the world to know who we are. Of course, you can be the most wonderful country in the world, but if nobody is telling your story, they will tell it their way and tell it their own way, and you won't like it, I always say. So I think I must start with you, Moki, the owner of this report. It's a very important report. Why this and why now?
Okay, great. So for those of you who don't know the report we're talking about, it's called The Cost of Media Stereotypes. And what Africa No Filter did was we were trying to elevate the issue of this narrative, trying to figure out how do we get the world to be aware that there is an implication, there's an impact to the way the world sees Africa and through this negative frame. So what we did, we worked with an organization called Practice. And what we did, we've looked at media's contribution specifically because that's something we can change. So we looked at an issue that gets covered by every single video, by every country and by every single media organization, and that was elections. So we did this pre-COVID, so it was elections that happened in 2018, 2019, and maybe more in 2020. And we took 7 countries, 4 in Africa, 3 outside of Africa, to compare the kind of coverage that they were given over an election period. And what we found was that the elections in Africa got a lot more coverage, but the coverage they got was a lot more negative. And a lot of the time it was election violence, ethnic, ballot rigging. It was all the negative words. That's probably why the elections got more coverage, because they were negative stories. So what we did after that, we looked at how much African countries pay for interest rates. So we looked at bond yields, and we see most people know in this room that Africa pays a higher interest rate than most of countries. It's because of this perceived risk premium. So we took that risk premium, and there have been other studies that show that if a media perception had a direct correlation to investments. So if you are investing, 10% of your decision to invest in something is based on what you read. So there's a 10% figure that we took to say media's coverage of Africa contributes to people's investment into Africa at 10%. And that figure, when we extrapolated it across the continent, was $4.2 billion. So our figure tells you that the cost of this media narrative to the continent is $4.2 billion every single year. And that is enough to educate 12 million children every single year. It's enough to give vaccinations to 75 million people every year. So it's real, it's tangible. And I'll tell you the one thing that report did for us, it's put the conversation on map, because we're talking numbers now. And people understand that there's a real cost to this. So that's why I did the report.
4.2 billion is a lot for Africa. It's a lot for Africa. And there's so much.
Like Syria, there's a couple of hundred GDP. It is about 4.something billion.
Thank you. I'm going to come back to you now, Gina. As a business owner who has worked with many African presidents, how has been your personal experience on this media bias on your operations?
Well, it's impacted every single country that I've worked with. Obviously, there's you only see the one side, which is the negative side, and yet the progress that's being made in those countries is very rarely reported on. So it definitely has impacted. And I think, a lot of the correspondence for Africa, for foreign correspondents, are based in key countries like Johannesburg, like Nairobi, like Lagos. And we've seen it. We've seen, times when there's been positive things happening in those countries that very rarely get reported on. And yet, there's one skirmish, and it's conflict. And you see all those words. There's poverty, there's conflict, there's a humanitarian catastrophe. But yet there's so much progress on the continent that very rarely gets reported.
Can you give us specific examples of where things have really gone wrong?
Yeah, I mean, we have had, as you know, recently we had the state visit of our president in Kenya to the US when he went to see President Biden. And there was lots of trade deals and MOUs signed with various businesses at that time in the US. Really exciting stuff for Kenya. And a month later, we had the Gen Z protests. And it was literally, I mean, the protests were bad, don't get me wrong, but what happened was it was all over the international media that Kenya was basically burning down. So how many of those trade deals will actually translate into business? I'm really not sure. I don't have the numbers, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of investors were quite afraid.
And how does this make you feel?
But it's just very sad because it's not balanced. I think the thing is, I think if it was more balanced, it would be fine. But a lot of the onus is on African countries as well to tell their own story. And I think that's something that we need to keep saying. As much as we're complaining about the international media, it's really up to us as Africans to own our narrative and to tell our stories. And that's what I tell every country that I work with, that it's fine. Storytelling must be part of the KPIs of public sector. It must, just as much as we have budgets for agriculture or education or health, communications and storytelling must have a budget line.
Thank you. Yinka, as someone who owns a platform, a media platform, who's also from Africa, as much as you are based in the US, you have a network across the world. What are your views? How have you experienced this across these countries? For example, what are the similarities in terms of the coverage, and where are the differences?
Thank you for the question. I mean, there's no doubt that, it's something I was talking about earlier. It's about the number of stories that are told about Africa on the world stage. I mean, that's kind of the start of my sort of thinking about it as a journalist. The fewer stories you have, there is a tendency for journalists, for all of us to sort of focus. And even it's not just journalists; it's just human beings. It's just the way we focus on things. We focus on the thing that gets people excited, that gets people concerned, that gets people worried about their investments, about whatever it is. That's what people focus on. So when you only have a few stories about a huge place with over 50 countries of 1.4 billion people, and those few stories are about the Gen Z protest in Kenya and not about, I don't know, Silicon Savannah or something else happening in Kenya. And that's the only story you see, and the only time you ever hear about the Central African Republic is in the context of Russian doing something and said, nobody, the average non-Africans doesn't even know. In fact, I would say the average African probably doesn't know, other than the name, couldn't identify where it is on a map, right? But these are the same stories that you hear, regardless of whether it's a small economy or a big economy, because there's just not enough stories told. There's not enough of a variety of stories. And that just has this cumulative effect, which Murky's report kind of deals into there, which is, this is the same thing we keep on seeing. So therefore, well, something happened in Kenya, so I was going to invest in Senegal, but something's happening in Kenya. Like there's no correlation between those two things, but that's the kind of accumulative effect that you get, that just has added up over not just a few years, but for decades, and it's just gone on and on. And it's very real. I've had these debates in newsrooms, in London, in New York, where there is just a certain perception about what the story should be, that even well-educated people, even people who think they are open-minded, just have a natural tendency to say, this is the type of story we tell about Africa, because that's what we've always done, right? And that's what's good about the conversations like this and it's good about the reports. And I could quibble with a few things, but about the report specifically, but I will say, I will. But I will say it's such an important conversation to have and to raise, because it's kind of been ignored, right? Because media isn't often thought about in terms of that context of how it's impacting everything else.
When I went through the report the first time, I got the feeling that I think we sometimes forget we are Africans first, and we tend to hand our power over to other people to tell our stories. But Wendy, I'm going to connect to you. What has your experience been as a media specialist and a PR specialist for a while? That's not to say to tell our age at this point, but you've been in this game for a long time. And how have you experienced it from a business perspective?
Having worked in both the public sector and the private sector, I think what Monkey's report for me does is it mirrors and I think elevates the conversation for us to have it now, right? But it's a conversation that has dogged us as the continent for time immemorial, right? I remember being in tourism in Germany in 2003 and was grappling with how do we differentiate the continent, the countries in terms of our offerings outside of just animals and wildlife and the fauna and flora, right? Because that's what we've always been known for. So the way that it is manifested for me across the different sectors I've worked in, I think is that it even dumps down our populations about the stories they tell about us, right? So our young people are growing up being told stories about themselves from a different listing. And there isn't enough impetus on telling African stories by Africans through mediums that are owned by Africans. The second thing that I think has always bothered me about it is that, we talk about narratives, we talk about perceptions, and I've come to realize that the perceptions for a lot of people are reality, right? And that's what they know and that's what they believe. the conversation that I wish we would have on platforms like this, at places like this, in moments of this time is, what are we as Africans gathered here who are talking amongst ourselves, really, right? What are we going to put behind changing this narrative? It's one thing to have these conversations about how it's problematic, but are we actually investing in the means of creating the content that we want to tell about ourselves? Are we investing in the platforms and giving those platforms the time for them to mature and be competitive at a scale and reach in order for us to tell our stories? But if we're not having those conversations, all we're really doing is how are we as Africans trying to fit in somehow into global narratives and make a... Guys, no, we can't do that. Not in 2025. The conversation should be, what influence are we having on our policies in our different governments? What conversations are we having with the private sector? What conversations are we having with philanthropists to say, how do we invest in the means of production of content? How do we invest in the means of distribution of content? And how do we invest in the means of creating that content about us that we tell to the world? Otherwise, I fear, to be honest, that in 20 years' time, we're going to be still having this conversation.
I'm going to come back to that because I do need us to discuss what are the solutions going forward. What do we all need to start doing as Africans? But Mogi, get back to you. What was the most surprising thing you discovered as you were doing this analysis?
You know, it's difficult to say what was the super surprising thing, because I think we knew a lot of this. What we were looking for was the evidence. So there wasn't really anything surprising, although I will say that, at the time, one of the countries that we analyzed was Malaysia. And at the time, Malaysia was going through this scandal, 1MDB Bank, the bank. And the Prime Minister, ultimately, he was going to that when the elections came in. But it was quite funny that when you looked at the analysis, looked at the coverage, it wasn't a big deal in the coverage, the global coverage of the elections in Malaysia at the time. And that just goes to show that, people have very strong ways of looking at countries. When you look at, Switzerland, it's efficient, things never go wrong. Germany, the trains don't run very fast, but they're very efficient. But when you look at Malaysia, it's not known necessarily for corruption. So it's difficult to start seeing it as a corrupt country, so they just write what they know. And for me, that was what was surprising, that we're so entrenched in our belief system that's the very difficult thing for us to unpack, to actually get people to move and change the way they see the continent.
I know this report focused primarily on media, but I want to go back to Wendy's comment about how the stories we tell about ourselves, and that includes the creative industry, where you see soapies that are always about taxi violence, women being beaten up and all the time. At some stage, I think we do need to do that analysis as well, because it's not enough to just be thinking that the media are the people who are telling this story, and we are not taking some kind of accountability to our creative storytellers, right?
You're absolutely right, because we don't only work with media. Because of this report, a lot of our focus, a lot of things that you're talking about are very media. We also, we wrote something recently for the Last Mile Film Fund, because we know about the power of film to influence. Because I also talk about, I don't know about America's superpower because I read extensive on papers. I watched Top Gun. That's why I think America's films could be powerful, right? So we wanted to, do the same with African filmmakers. So we launched this thing called Last Mile Film Fund, because we know how huge amounts of money. The idea was to try and find films that were really shifting the way people saw. I mean, you could find another, Wakanda type movie, but the movies that were pitched to us, I always hum myself, there were just movies that were depressing and just, our filmmakers were so unhealthy in reality, separate of reality. And the other problem that they said was, I'm not funding from this NGO, from this, but it's to tell the gender-based violence story. We need to tell her this. So a lot of the money that comes into film is there to perpetuate the stereotype. So that's the first thing. Our filmmakers probably aren't being creative enough, but where they're getting the funding is keeping them down. It's keeping those stories, not to be what we want them to be. So yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Gina, what do you think we need to change?
So I think a lot of the perceptions are driven by us as Africans, and I think that comes from a trust factor of many governments. So if we're unhappy with governments or the way things are being run, then we're very, very negative. And if you look at many countries on the continent, the trust deficit is just so wide that we tend to be very negative. So we're not, even if government is doing something great, we're so upset with them on the economy or cost of living, health issues. So we're just repeating very negative things. So if we as Africans are negative, then what do we expect from foreign media?
Where are the solutions, Yinka?
Solutions. I still will harp on about a variety of stories, right? Because the one thing the journalists in me that can never change is I'm not into this idea of telling so-called positive stories, right? And there are terrible things that are happening in many societies, many countries. We can't overlook that, right? So really important that's well, as journalists, which is totally different from creating stories. But like I said, if you don't have enough stories, you're always going to elevate the ones that are the same stereotype stories. But one thing I will say though as well, it is more broadly speaking, this is why this conversation is important, it is more broadly speaking about that kind of change of mindset. And you see certain words. The favorite word in the West now, in the sort of last decade, in any story to do with Africa, the favorite word is always corruption. Like there's no corruption in Washington, D.C. or London. Or, these are incredibly corrupt places. But, they have systems. They're called lobbyists, things like that. They have well-organized systems. And we have to be careful. It's like, I literally had an edit of a story today, which was in this journalists, I would say the country goes through it, that's clear, so we'll carry out this. But I was literally saying to this journalist in the country, like, this problem you're talking about, and you just very casually said corruption was one of the problems with your country. Is like, well, actually, there are more specific issues going on here that you haven't gone into, but you've just thrown in the word corruption because, that's what they want, right? It's always corruption. It's like, well, there's corruption everywhere. The problem is things don't work. The lights aren't on, the water isn't running. That's what the problem is, right? And it's not just because of corruption, it's because you're not running a country properly, right? So I think there's a kind of an intellectual laziness that's really applied to Africa, right? And that we buy into it. Right, we really just saw, of course, they're all corrupt, they're all stealing money. But actually, people steal money all the time, and they're trains around the time, right? So it's not just because of corruption; it's because you're not actually doing your jobs properly. But thinking about that in the context of media, it's just we just need to have a sort of true to our mindset as well, which is a little bit more of a philosophical thing, which is a difficult thing to sort of narrow down. It's not like saying 4.2 billion or something, But there is an issue where we do need to think about how we tell stories beyond just ticking these boxes that we tend to do, and that's how you get a lot of those same stories we complain about.
Wendy?
Perhaps to just extend on that, I think that so Elon Musk has started this whole thing of calling what we've always known as traditional media as legacy media, right? Which make it sound really bad. But I think we underestimate the power and the influence of citizen journalism. I think that we have, for the longest time, relied on legacy or just traditional media to tell our stories. Yes, they have got reach. Yes, they've got scale. Yes, they've got potentially a more trusting relationship with audiences because they've been there for so long. And that is great. And they're an important part of the ecosystem. But I think that we underestimated just how powerful individuals have become simply because of a device. They've got a camera, they've got a microphone, and they've got a voice. And I think that with our populations where they are, with the fact that our populations are very young, there is a massive opportunity for us to leverage that citizen journalism, that access to means of communication, and the ability to tell these multifaceted stories about our country. Whether they be in the creative arts, whether they be in financial services, whether it be in tourism. But I think that it's critically important that we find the white spaces where we can really be competitive in telling our own story, rather than trying to be competitive in cases where we just don't have the capital to put it on, right? Nor the means to be at. So I think that's one part of the solution. The other part of the solution that I really want to agitate amongst us sitting here is, how do we, in our respective roles and responsibilities, whether it's in corporate, in public sector, or in the civil society, how do you start agitating your organization to do the right thing, right? Because we cannot separate the profitability of our organizations from the societies in which they operate. And I think media perceptions and media relationships and how we tell the stories about those societies is critically important, and is actually aligned to the success of our entities that we work for. So how do we agitate in our little roles to say, how does my organization show up in telling a narrative about the continent? And how do we put investment behind that may not necessarily give us returns in the immediate term, but certainly, I think, a well-functioning society that tells better stories of itself is likely to be a highly successful one in the future.
Yeah, can I do something? Because I think like panels that we all agree.
Yeah.
We all agree with each other. So I want to disagree with you, Yuka, because you said that you don't want to do positive stories. And that's the reason why I don't call positive stories. We talk about better stories. Because I think media's role is not just to reflect what is going wrong. It's equally to reflect what is working. It's to reflect society. And there's a lot of progress being made in Africa. And I think this aversion that journalists have to positive stories, because they tend to think it's like the cat stories or, like cuddly animal stories, and they go at the back of the news to cheer people up. It's not. It's just, it's to what's going on in society. And the reason why I think legacy media, digital media had to think about this is that young people who make up the bulk of this continent are creating their own news sources, because legacy media, digital media, are not addressing their needs. But one of our grantees, her name is Maria Mbulu. She's a Tanzanian American. She has a platform called Hebarni Njeri. She has, I know, 500,000 followers on TikTok, but she has, some of her posts have 8.5 million views. And she's just telling what she calls, different stories, just informational stories about Africa. She's not a journalist. She's not a trained journalist, but 8.5 million views. That's bigger than traditional legacy media. She's a powerhouse. And she's like 22 or 23. So the point I'm making, media doesn't shift towards telling the kind of inspirational stories that affirm the work and effort that this continent is putting in to making the continent move. People are going to make it up, or they're going to just find their news sources. So I actually want to just credit you, actually, because I think Semaphore does actually a brilliant job of telling stories. You've covered arts and culture more than any other publication either, Main Street. You cover all the other things that we're really good at. And I'm going to end with this. Africa is very good. And I don't want to say Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, we're good at arts, culture, creativity. We're very into it, because a lot of time we had to be. And I think that a lot of those innovations, all that creativity, because it's not being covered in the news, it somehow doesn't mean anything. Afrobeat, Wizkid, Burna Boy, Davido, they've done so much for changing the way a whole generation of the world will use this concept. With one record, Brema, calm down. Don't you guys calm down? What do you think about that? You don't think about clumsy brushing color copies? That's where I want to be. I want to go to Desi December. And the point, in that Dirty December, there's some stuff going on WhatsApp about money, about 500,000 visitors how they came to Lagos. for the diaspora. It's a massive story for Nigeria. I don't know who's covered it. I'm sure you're going to cover it if you haven't already. But I'm just saying that let's not diss positive stories. Let's not diss positive stories.
I think let's give him an opportunity to respond.
I definitely want to correct what's the... Doesn't yet we just agree with each other. Sorry. Because I want to clarify that when I say positive story, this, for example, at Crossrail, for here, Singapore, we cover, a startup getting funding, but that's a positive story. I don't see it as a positive story. It says a positive business story that transforms, it's the first steps in helping to transform an economy. I think what I push back at is the idea of something being called a business. I like the idea of, say, that's a story. I think just having a wider lens to what you think is important, right? So that you don't just think, as you said, this over coverage of elections, that democracy surviving excess stuff through, right? I didn't, United States. I don't know if democracy does all, stuff. You don't get enough of that, So that's how I think it's just that framing of positive stories, as if you cover something for nice.
No.
And not because actually it's through
PR.
But there are lots of possibilities that happen, but some are actually significant to the impact it has on the society. It has a new record. That's fine, right? That's totally fine. But actually, the bigger story is what you said. Like, actually, this is transforms it in the way people perceive these countries. The number of kids of a certain age who are trying to figure out Yoruba words, what's it hurt them back then, trying to understand pidgin English. And it's like, this is crazy. I couldn't force about, it's just something you can force about, as well as for things like tourism. Exactly. But that bigger story is the story, right? Rather than just say, oh, that's nice. You've sold a lot of records, which is fine. But
Tina, you and I were having a discussion just before we started this session, and we were saying, how do we use the platform of Africa South Africa presiding over the G20 to change the story of Africa?
So I think, because the chairmanship is with South Africa, should not just be a South African initiative. I think it's very important for the whole of the continent. So I think Africa needs to be ready to take this opportunity to tell the African story. Being part of G20 is huge, but the onus shouldn't just be on South Africa. So it's important for the whole of the continent. But before we open it up, I just wanted to give you an example. When now former First Lady Jill Biden came to Kenya at the end of 2023, she came with sort of about 200 journalists with her, and we had a very interesting session with women. And the First Lady went to have a look and to see how Kenya was responding to a terrible drought. She met with women who had been doing table banking. Really positive initiatives. And then we're all sitting having this press conference, and one journalist said, "First Lady, we just want to ask you, is President Biden running again?" And she said, "What part of that message don't you understand? The president is running." And that was it. There was no more coverage about table banking, drought. The headline was, President Biden has confirmed he's running again. So I think, it's also, the responsibility is on journalists to give a more balanced view. There was nothing about the initiative she'd actually seen.
I just want us to just think, for your final comments, about what do we hand over to the next generation of journalists and PR specialists. Briefly, what do we need to do? What is our responsibility towards our young people?
If we carry on at the same pace and we come back next year, we're having this conversation, and next year we're having the same conversation, we are going to leave a decimated media behind. And even more, a worse problem is that we're going to have foreigners or Western media continuing to tell our story for us. If we don't invest in media, if we don't support content creators. Right now, a million followers in Africa is not the same as a million followers in America. So they don't get compensated for their content, yet we want to put fresh content out there. So my entire thing is, we are a philanthropic fund that we called Africa Builder. All my money is American money. I'm embarrassed to say I don't have one call £1 of African funding to do the work we've done. We have capitalized $7.5 million this great government since we started. We get that $7.5 million in grant funding. The need is so much. And one small organization is far as can't do it all. So if we want to leave something behind, walk away and leave something on the ledger where we got to invest in our creative community and in our media.
Thank you. Wendy?
So the question was, what do we leave behind, or what do we want?
What legacy do we want to hand to the next generation?
Look, I want a generation of young people that are confident. That's really all I want, right? And a generation of young people that believe in themselves and the ability to conquer their circumstances, the continental one, the global one. That's really what I want to be. In terms of the storytelling and the narrative center, I want to leave a young people that believe that they can be the thought leaders of tomorrow, that they can be the investors in the means of communication of tomorrow. But that has to start with them seeing it now. That has to start with them seeing their stories being told or being at least appreciated by their home. Because I think a big part of our problem is we talk down about ourselves, right? We're good at that. We're almost apologetic about being African, and it's almost that we were walking around shares. Yes, this thing on our backs. And I really want us to let go of that. So how do we do it? I'm going to answer this gentleman's question of our strategies. So for me, I think it's a multifaceted strategy. One is about how do we fix the ownership of means of media in our continent, and how do we agitate investors, philanthropists, corporates, and governments to create environments and to create funds or have capital that people can have access to create those means of communication. Secondly, though, I think we'll all, and I think because we're exhausted of this word, but we underestimate the impact and value of thought leaders. Thought leaders sit in academia, they sit in different facets of society. How do we elevate those people to have a seat at the table? Because that's how you start to sit and change narratives. How do we write stories about ourselves? So let's become authors of our own stories, right? Whether we have to self-fund or whatever it is, but let's start, because the strategies have to change with us doing the small little steps every single day with what we have, because that's how you start to effect change. So when I see authors by African people, today, young people writing books about their stories because they believe their stories need to be shared. I think that's one way of doing it. So there's many strategies, and I think we just need to be open to exploring them. And failing, guys. There's nothing wrong with failing.
Actually, definitely, I think a lot about training the next generation of journalists working with freelancers and trying to see people eventually, move on to better things. At one point, you two African journalists on the New York Times, African seeing were people who had grew up with you before the course. And I feel that we just need more of that, right? Need more of that. And something that we haven't kind of brought up because we've been talking about media specifically. I know this is kind of ties into the work that Tebe and South Africa. It's just this idea of countries thinking themselves about how it's acts. And clearly, right now on the continent, even though the South Africans are work on this, but the country that does it the best, whether you agree with them or not, is Rwanda.
Yeah,
They tell a story. As a journalist, I have some stand, but they consistently. Rwanda is the only country that I have dealt with on the continent where I get the same feeling I used to have when I covered big, S&P 500 companies, and you wrote something about them, you get called right away. Oh, there's a comma that should have been there, because because it just wants to control the story. I get it as a journalist. Of course, I felt about I'm forced to kind of take them seriously. Yeah, like this country, one of the poorest countries. Most people here have a really positive view, but it's one of the poorest countries on the continent, right? In terms of the size of this economy and actual GDP per capita, of everyone here takes them seriously. Yeah, and that's the work people saying. Very few African countries do this. Like literally not.
Yeah.
Do this, and this is kind of part of that bigger picture of how yes, we want as a media, we want media to be stronger. We want better journalists to be trained. Also, there's also that part of this as well. There's a bit of top down as well, which is how are you yourself? What story are you telling to your people? Now, some of it might become about, but just be serious about how you're seeing.
Yeah.
Just calling out other countries or other media about how you're seeing. There's something to be said for getting people to sit up, take notice. And sometimes that actually can backfire because people then pay attention and realize actually what you're saying is not totally correct. That's not the issue. The issue is that no one even cares. So thinking about that.
Gina?
I think for me, it's actually to get governments to realize the importance of storytelling. Because I think what happens in Africa is we go from one election cycle to the next without stopping and actually governing or telling the stories. So we're in constant election mode. As soon as we've won one election, our focus is on the next one. So I think it would be, and then the last thing that I'd like to say is, do foreign correspondents have to be foreign? And I think, if correspondents for foreign media were Africans, we might have a different narrative. So.
I'd like to end it off by saying I would like to be able to tell my daughter as she gets into this media world what I knew then and that I didn't know now, that she can learn from so that we can get better journalists, better stories, not positive stories, better stories. I'd like to end the recording here for this point in time. Thank you, everyone. I did say these are top dogs, and aren't they?